Just turn one on for now, or else sometimes you get it.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's fine. So I'd like to welcome everyone. I'm Dan Bryant, Executive Director of SquareOne Villages, and I'm realizing I need to turn my sound off. Hearing myself. At any rate, I'm Dan Bryant, Executive Director of SquareOne Villages, and I'll let our other two panelists introduce themselves, and then we'll get started.
Andrew Heben, Project Director with SquareOne Villages.
Dave Carbonell, independent developer.
So we're thrilled that you're here to share with us. What I'd like to do is just briefly tell you the story of SquareOne Villages and how we got into this work. And then we'll hear more from Andy here about the specifics for this particular workshop, and Dave will give us an example as a developer. So I think everyone, I'm sure, here is familiar with the current crisis in which we are in, which I like to say is not a mental health crisis. It's not a substance abuse crisis. It's not a jobs issues crisis. It's a housing crisis. And it's housing that we need to address. And even though those are critical components of the current crisis that we are in, but just fundamentally, it is a housing crisis, and ultimately that is the solution. I'm actually a preacher by trade, spent 29 years as pastor of Downtown Church in Eugene, and so I have very strong feelings about this from a variety of different perspectives. But I'll try not to give a sermon today. I just want to note that, I think in our society, there's a certain stigma and shame that's associated with being homeless. But for me personally, I think the real shame is that we have made it nearly impossible for the unhoused to live with any dignity among us. And that's one of the reasons why I use this particular picture. Well, in the wake of the Occupy movement back in 2011, we had folks in Eugene that were protesting along with the occupiers in Wall Street. And as part of that protest, they were camping out. And the unhoused in our community said, cool, you figured out a way that you can legally camp in the city. Can we join you? And they did. And what evolved was a little community of about 200 folks, mostly unhoused, who were camping out for about 6 months in the city. And when that was disbanded at the end of 2011, a number of advocates, including myself and Andy here, got together with some of these unhoused folks and began strategizing on things we could do to provide a solution, or at least a partial solution to this crisis. And we held a series of meetings with the unhoused themselves at the church I was pastoring at the time. We had a free breakfast, and we invited people to stay behind at the breakfast if they were interested in working with us on this concept. And that whittled itself down to 15 unhoused folk who were our co-collaborators with whom we developed the concept of a semi-autonomous village consisting of 30 tiny homes, we called them at the time. And we asked the city council to give us an acre of land for 1 year as just a pilot project to see if we could try out our concept of a semi-self-governed village. And the city council agreed, and we opened up our first project in the August of 2013 that we call Opportunity Village Eugene. It was the first of its kind in the state of Oregon, other than Dignity Village here in the Portland area that had started about a decade before that, and we consulted quite a bit with folks at Dignity Village. And it's still going 9 years later, so this pilot project for 1 year, still there. And it has helped about 150 people over that 9-year period achieve housing. I said we called them tiny homes, but in truthfulness, they're really just sleeping cabins, 8 by 8, 8 by 10, insulated, but at the time they had no power, no heat. We have since added electricity and heating to the units. But most importantly is that they provided a secure place where someone could store their belongings, where they had a bed and they had a locked door, right? And just think of the importance of that for someone who's been living on the street to now be able to sleep behind a locked door where they were safe and secure, didn't have to worry about someone waking them up in the middle of the night. Together with another nonprofit in Eugene called Community Supported Shelters, we built 10 of these Conestogas, as we call them. That particular nonprofit has built over 260 of these that are scattered throughout the Eugene, Springfield area. Our facilities also include a shower, a pantry, cooking area, laundry, broadband internet, a large yurt for meeting space. And it has become a nice little community where villagers share in the task of operating the village. We do this with a half-time staff person because we expect the villagers to share in the responsibilities for managing the building, managing the project. We have about $100,000 budget. For this, the villagers themselves pay $35 if they are able. In some cases, if they don't have any income, then we work out alternatives for that. So the biggest challenge that we found in doing this work was helping people to find housing once we helped them stabilize their situation, got them on the Oregon Health Plan, helped them work out their disability or help them get jobs, whatever the case was, and then tried to help them find housing. And what we discovered was there was no housing. There's a dearth of housing, especially for small households of a single or a individual. And one of the reasons for that we quickly discovered was that the waiting list for affordable housing was so long. So for a family that needs a 3-bedroom unit at that time, the wait list was about a year. For a family needing 2 or 4 bedrooms, the wait list was 2 to 3 years. But if you're a single individual or you're a couple like my friends Juan and Rhonda in this picture, the wait time, and all you needed was a single bedroom, studio, smallest apartment. The wait time was over 6 years. And I knew that there were folk out there who didn't have 6 years. Indeed, Juan here actually died about 2 years ago after living at our village for that entire time. So at least we were able to give him a stable place and some dignity, but it has always bothered me that we were not able to finally move him into true housing. Rhonda, on the other hand, is finally moving into housing. Well, one of the reasons, and I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir here, that we have this lack of affordable housing is just simply because it's so expensive, and typically more expensive than regular market rate housing, according to the Meyer study from a number of years ago. I think it was about 25% more. And a 2019 report from the Oregon Housing and Community Services found that the average cost was $229,000. Now that's 2019, and we all know those costs have skyrocketed. Most projects that I know are $300,000 and up per unit. I just read an article recently in California where there are 7 different projects at $1 million per unit. Hopefully we're not quite there yet in Oregon. But meanwhile, we know that in our community, we have about 4,000 people in a typical month, according to our homeless by name list, who are without housing. And I know that there's a big challenge here in the metro area, but actually Eugene has a higher rate of unsheltered homeless per capita than Portland. In fact, by some studies, we have the highest per capita rate in the nation. So we have a real crisis. So to get 4,000 units of housing for those folks would take over $900 million. The budget, the entire city budget for Eugene is $860 million. So there's just clearly we're not going to be able to build our way out of this problem using traditional models. So we decided that we needed to get into the business of building affordable housing. Now you have to know at the time we made this decision, we had just transitioned from being an all-volunteer organization to we hired Andy as our project director, and I was working quarter time as executive director and splitting the rest of the time with the church. But we decided that we knew enough that we could actually build housing. It's a little bit of a joke there, but but we did it. And we called it Emerald Village Eugene, as I like to say, particularly as a preacher. Eve, the mother of tiny home villages, is affordable housing. And the way we did it was we found 13 architects who all donated their services to us. We paired them with builders who also donated their services, and we got 13 homes that were donated to us. It's $500,000 of in-kind contributions, and then we built another 9 ourselves from the fundraising we did. So tiny homes, and I mean tiny, 200 up to 256 square feet and smaller, but with a full bath, kitchenette, very high quality, not cheaply built. We raised about 1.2 million for this project. It was actually appraised at 3 million after we were finished. The average cost per home, including the in-kind contributions, is just $77,000. So we feel like, you know, just from the numbers, it's you know, a pretty phenomenal project, and it really is a cute little community. And by virtue of the fact that you had 13, well, actually, plus our designs, 14, 15, 16 different designs, so it's very eclectic. And the really unique thing about it is we don't manage it. We organize the residents into their own co-op. It's a leasehold co-op, meaning they lease and hold the property from us. They turn around and charge their members a carrying charge. When we first opened, it varied from $250 to $350 a month. Find a quality house, you know, for that in this area, or any area, right? And 50 of that was their membership in their co-op that maxes out at $1,500. So after 30 months, they've paid off their membership, and now their carrying charge actually goes down. And that gave them a little bit of headroom that if need be, they could raise that carrying charge. And I think they did $5, wasn't it, that they raised it here last year. But they own and operate the co-op. Similar to a manufactured home park, there's a clubhouse for board meetings, committee meetings, for private events, birthday parties. You know, it's got a full kitchen in it, and laundry facilities. This has really been a life changer for many, if not all, of our villagers. LeBeau here, testifying at our fundraiser, our annual fundraising dinner, told us how he lives on disability income. And because that's so low, he couldn't afford a place on his own. He was living with an abuser and was being abused on a regular basis. He said moving into this village where he could afford to pay his own way literally saved his life. And he took great pride in his home, picked his own colors, did much of the painting itself that you can see there on the right. And very proud. He loved showing off his home whenever we had tours. Well, we wanted to see if we could replicate this project in a rural community, and with help from a grant from Meyer Memorial Trust, we purchased an acre of land in Cottage Grove and built 13 tiny homes there. The per unit cost a little higher due to some of the development costs on this particular piece of property. It ran upwards to $120,000 per unit, but organized in the same way as a leased hold co-op, and has now been operating for a couple of years. And then just last year, we opened up our newest project and our smallest project, the C Street project in Springfield, with just 6 units. It's a fairly standard size looking home on a standard size family lot that's divided into a quad, and then an accessory dwelling unit in the back that is a duplex, so your 6 units. And the cost for that project is over $600,000. So again, about $100,000 per unit. It's been operating for a year, and the original 6 residents are still there. We have one mother and a child in one of the units. And yep, full bath. Yep.
I have floor plans in my slides, you'll see.
Yeah. So you'll see a little bit more. And this week, literally this week, we are breaking ground on our newest project we call Peace Village, which is 70 units, starting at 250. We have 5 different floor plans, starting at 256 square feet with a sleeping loft, and then on up to 2-bedroom units that are 788 square feet. The round circular buildings there is actually a church that's still operating. We bought the entire facility and we're leasing the church building back to the congregation, and then we're building on the vacant lot that's next to it. $11 million, all of which that we have raised, with about $6 million of that coming from the Oregon legislature. I don't know, upwards to $2 million that we have raised, and then the co-op itself will carry a mortgage of somewhere between 1.8 and 2 million. And the unique thing about this project, along with the C Street project that Andy's going to go into greater detail about, is that it is a limited equity co-op where the residents don't just own the co-op, now they own a piece of the property. And that's what we are really here to tell you about, because we think this model of housing offers a number of advantages to give the individuals who are in it greater financial stability, greater certainty over their housing future, lower housing costs, and most importantly, just that pride and dignity that so many people have from owning their own home, because now they can truthfully say that they too are homeowners, even if only in part. But as a whole, the co-op owns the property. So we call this the village model, and I'll turn it over to Andy to go into more detail.
All right, sure. Thank you, Dan. And I think Dan did a good job of kind of providing the history and background of our organization over the past 10 years. And I'm going to really delve into some work we've been doing since 2019 under a grant from Meyer Memorial Trust, in which they put out a call for new, bold ideas to solve our affordable housing problem. And I'm a firm believer that if we're serious about solving this problem, we need to build a non-commercial housing sector in which we decommodify and democratize housing. And a lot of that comes down to ownership structure. So most low-income housing that gets developed is rental housing, where residents lack control, security of tenure, and equity. But that's not to say homeownership is a one-size-fits-all solution, particularly because in single-family homeownership, low-income households are exposed to significantly greater risk and are far less likely to generate wealth than higher-income households. So there is a third option, which is shared equity homeownership, which you may have been hearing more about recently. It's, I think, becoming a more popular model. And it promotes permanent affordability and sustainable wealth building for low-income households. And there's two main types of shared equity homeownership. There's community land trusts and limited equity cooperatives. And that's what we propose to research under the grant from Meyer Memorial Trust. So I'll just give a kind of a brief overview of both of those shared equity models. Community land trusts realize affordability by dividing ownership of the home and ownership of the land in order to mitigate speculative market forces. Each household owns their own individual house, while the CLT retains ownership of the underlying land. And then there's a long-term ground lease that ties the interests of both parties together. And the CLT provides ongoing support to the homeowners. One weakness of this model is that it still requires, while the costs are reduced by taking the speculative cost of land out of the equation, it still requires each household to qualify for a conventional mortgage, which isn't accessible to lower income households or unbankable households. So a possibly more accessible model of shared equity homeownership is limited equity cooperatives, which realize affordability through shared resources, self-management, and operating at cost. Rather than each household owning their own home, the co-op in a limited equity co-op owns the entire property. Each household purchases a membership share in the co-op, which gives them a right to access a dwelling unit, a vote in the co-op's governance, and an ownership stake. So the residents don't actually own their individual housing, they own a share in the co-op, and the co-op owns the housing. And in a market rate co-op, that share can be resold on the market for whatever the market will bear. We're here talking about limited equity co-ops, so that comes with a resale restriction on the appreciation of that membership share in order to balance modest equity building for the residents with the long-term interests of keeping it affordable for future households. And then members pay a monthly carrying charge to the co-op to cover all of the housing costs, which I'll get into later. And then one weakness of this model is that in hot housing markets, co-op members may be enticed to amend their bylaws to convert from a limited equity co-op to a market rate co-op. We saw this in the 1960s and the 1970s. There were 60,000 limited equity co-op units built in the US with HUD financing, low to zero interest loans spread over 40 years that allowed these co-ops to be built. But practically none of them exist today because after the affordability restrictions expired, residents, voted in their own self-interest to cash out on the shares, which was within their rights within that model.
They're probably regretting it if they moved to Florida right now.
So I'm kind of setting that up to show that there's advantages, I think, to combining both models here by combining a community land trust with a limited equity co-op. Under this concept, the community land trust retains ownership of the underlying land. The CLT bylaws restrict sale of land and set affordability controls, maintains an ongoing stewardship roles, and also retains an option to repurchase the buildings if the co-op defaults. And then the limited equity co-op leases the land from the CLT via a 99-year ground lease. They own and maintain the buildings and improvements on the land. The co-op bylaws set affordability controls, which is a second layer of affordability controls on top of the community land trust. And then members benefit from shared resources, security of tenure, operating at cost, and modest equity. And so this is my best effort at kind of showing this model in a diagram, kind of how the financing and legal structure of it all works. So on the left, you have the community land trust, which owns the land. In the middle, you have the limited equity co-op, which owns the improvement. And a long-term ground lease ties the interests of both parties together, sets the long-term affordability controls, and the limited equity co-op pays a ground lease fee to the community land trust to cover their overhead costs. In terms of financing, I think this is a big reason why this model is advantageous over a typical CLT if you're trying to serve lower or unbankable households, is that the land and the improvements are used to secure a single permanent loan on the project, which then goes to the co-op. The land is usually acquired in advance through subsidy or some other program, and then that loan is used against the buildings on the project. So that's one relationship there between the CLT and the LEC. And then on the right, you have the relationship between the limited equity co-op and the co-op members, of which, depending on the size, there could be any number. But each member holds a proprietary lease with the co-op and pays a monthly carrying charge. So in a lot of ways, it's similar arrangement to rental housing, but they also have a membership agreement and a membership share in the co-op, which makes them co-owners of the co-op. So they're effectively acting as their own landlord collectively. And I say that just because I think that's interesting as we get later on in the slides and think about funding sources for this, in that the way it's structured in many ways actually works in parallel to the way rental housing works, just that the members are, yeah. Is it what type of question is it? If there's a specific question on this slide you want me to clarify, but if there's general questions, maybe save them for the end. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Go for it.
Yeah, you need a mic so that the people on Zoom can.
There's also a question on Zoom, so I don't know if
we'll leave that up to you. I don't know if that's on.
I think so. Okay. I am wondering what you've learned or what the reasoning is behind putting this model forward rather than the co-op owning the land and individuals owning the improvements.
Yeah, and that's essentially what the manufactured dwelling parks co-ops do, which I have a slide on here later.
Okay.
I think the main reason is to have that separate outside entity that provides the long-term affordability controls by taking the land out of the equation. I think it's also helpful to have the community land trust serve as like an ongoing steward to the project over the course of long periods of time where there could be leadership turnover in the co-op, and they kind of hold the core mission together. And they also provide help in providing technical assistance and support to the co-op, in that a lot of these folks are not accustomed to owning a home and are coming out of rental housing, and there's many differences. And so the CLT kind of serves as kind of an education and training role too of bringing members up to speed on how to operate their own co-op.
There may also be tax benefits, depending on, we're trying to get we're working on legislation to provide a property tax exemption for this kind of housing co-op, but it's not there yet. Whereas a community land trust can be tax exempt.
Yeah, so currently under this model, we can get a property tax exemption for the value of the land, but not yet the buildings. And I'll also get into that later because I think that's a major barrier. Oh, we opened the floodgates here.
I asked.
Yeah, okay. So I'm Mary Vogel, and I'm on the steering committee with Andy. So I'm very, very familiar with this, and I'm also familiar with Eugene. I probably lived there maybe 40 years ago. But in any case, and the East Blair Co-op, back then it wasn't, I don't think it was even a co-op, but it was.
That's what I have
Yeah,
pictured there
but
actually, and was
it
a
wasn't
big
very
inspiration
big.
for us.
I mean, but in larger co-ops, what's wrong with actually combining both the limited equity co-op and some market rate co-op? I think personally, I would rather live in a building that had both.
Yeah.
I mean, because people, low income people, need the stimulation of other people who are not low income.
Yeah. I think that could be a challenge. That ultimately comes down, so the co-op has its own set of bylaws, and you can write anything in those bylaws, and that's where the limit on the equity gets written in. So I think it would be challenging to do both. It could theoretically be possible in your bylaws that you could limit the equity on a certain number of household shares and not others, but I don't know. I think I should get through maybe the rest of my presentation though, because I feel like I might answer some of your questions, and if I don't answer, I might give them a little bit more context and information. So this is just another breakdown of my previous slide, looking at kind of how this all works. I covered ownership structure. In terms of management structure, the common spaces and the dwellings are maintained by the LEC, the co-op. The interior of the dwellings are maintained by the member, and then technical assistance is provided by the CLT. And underneath, I gave a couple of just examples of how the financing can work. So at move-in, you purchase a share in the co-op. That share can be as much or as little as you want. The higher it is, the less equity or the less subsidy and debt financing you have to get for the project. But also the higher it is, the less accessible it is to a low-income household. So there's kind of a balancing act there. We found $10,000 to be a fair and reasonable amount for our C Street project, which was targeting people between 60 and 80% area median income. And that share purchase can also, that upfront cost can be made more accessible by combining sweat equity components. IDA accounts can be used for this, or loans, which I'll get more into later. So that's the initial purchase, and then the maximum resale formula is the initial share price plus an annual interest rate. We use 3% simple interest per year, plus improvements. So that's the share purchase. And then the monthly carrying charge, which I kind of compared to rent earlier, is essentially each household paying the costs of what it costs to operate their housing. So they're operating quality housing at cost. So a ground lease fee, utilities, maintenance, a long-term reserve for replacing the roof, principal, interest, taxes, and insurance, principal on the loan. So that's just some examples of what all goes into the monthly costs that folks are paying to the co-op. The primary advantages we see of combining the CLT and the LEC is that it provides an accessible pathway to homeownership for a demographic that may have no other pathway to homeownership and is otherwise relegated to rental housing, largely because of that piece of not having to qualify for a conventional mortgage individually. Second, permanent affordability. So It's an effective use of public subsidy because once a dollar is invested in the project, it stays in the project. Stability and control to the residents through security of tenure, long-term affordability controls, and democratic governance. And also the multi-layered ownership structure ensures a safe and secure investment. And what I mean by that is kind of that tripart structure that I presented earlier, that where if an individual member has an issue, the co-op has an interest in remedying it. And if the co-op runs into an issue, then the CLT has an interest in remedying it. So it's not just a single household on an island. There's a multi-layered relationship there. And we did find there is a group in Washington that has been implementing this model since 1992, the Lopez Community Land Trust on Lopez Island, a small island of just 2,000 people. And they've built 6 limited equity co-ops on CLT land ranging in size from 4 to 11 units. So this is it's quite small scale housing development, but it's also on rural communities. So that size kind of makes sense for their community. The income eligibility ranges from 36 to 120% AMI, but the average income at their co-ops is 50% AMI. And they also provide a very interesting example of mitigating that upfront share purchase through significant sweat equity component. They do sort of a habitat model where the incoming residents sign up and work with carpenters to actually build their own housing, and that provides sort of some of that upfront equity in the housing. We were interested under this grant to create a more scalable solution to the housing problem, though, and so we wanted to look at a larger scale example. And I think here in Oregon, where cooperative housing is pretty unfamiliar, there has been some recent familiarity brought to it, particularly with the manufactured dwelling park co-ops, which are developed by CASA as an affiliate of resident-owned communities. Since 2008, I believe they built 14 manufactured housing parks ranging from 23 to 143 households per co-op. And as we were getting at earlier, it is a different ownership structure than what we are proposing, in that the co-op owns the land in the park and that each resident owns their own manufactured dwelling. So we thought those provided 2 interesting case studies. We had also developed 2 leasehold co-ops prior to receiving this grant that Dan kind of went into. Both Emerald Village and Cottage Village were leasehold co-ops. So they leased the entire property from SquareOne Villages, and kind of that next step that we wanted to take was figure out how to give the co-op more ownership over their housing and transition from a limited equity co-op, which is largely treated as rental housing from a subsidy perspective, and you can apply for rental sources for that, to a limited equity co-op in which the co-op actually owns the housing. So this represents the first CLT-LEC project in Oregon. We completed it exactly a year ago, just about the end of September last year. And we wanted to start with a small scale project, and this is basically a typical residential lot. And from the street, it looks like a 1,600 square foot single family house and an 800 square foot ADU. So in addition to being a CLT-LEC, it was also a pilot of a middle housing project under HB 2001. This was actually built as a precursor to that law going into effect. So these are not actually 6 dwelling units, they're 6 suites. So this is the floor plan here of the single family house. There's a foyer that you walk into in the front, and then 2 suites off to left and right, and then up the stairs there's a suite off the left and the right. Each unit with a full bathroom and a bedroom. The nuance here, in order for this to technically only be 1 dwelling unit, is that you could only have 1 range to qualify as a full kitchen. So the other 3 units have cooktops. So, but now that the middle housing code amendments have gone into effect, you could now build this project as 6 separate dwelling units, particularly in Portland, where you have the deeper affordability option, and you can do 6 units on just about any property in town. So we provided 6 households a permanently affordable homeownership option through this project, $10,000 purchase price. 4 of the households were able to afford that upfront through savings. One we offered a $5,000 loan to, and the 6th one was in an IDA program that didn't mature until later, a few months later, and so we loaned them money until that program matured, and then they pay that off with the IDA account. The buildings are net zero ready, 10-minute walk to downtown, and compared to low-income rental housing, less than half the development cost at $100,000 per suite, and less than 10% of the subsidy. It took us just $20,000 per suite to reach an affordability level of 60% AMI for a one-person household. And looking at the sources for that cost of $600,000 for the project, or $100,000 per suite, total sources per suite. The CLT provided, the cost of the land came out to $10,000 per unit. SquareOne acquired the land and did that through foundation grants. The residents put $10,000 each up as their equity in the housing through the share purchase. We received CDBG funding through the city of Springfield using homeowner down payment assistance towards this. So we effectively doubled the amount of the share purchase through covering 50% of it through subsidy. And then the co-op holds a mortgage at $65K per loan, or $65K per suite. And then we had a secondary loan of social investors that provided the gap funding. So the monthly housing costs are affordable to someone at 60% AMI. The income limit and permanent affordability level is 80% AMI. And the turnover after 12 months of occupancy has been 0. So it seems like that is a sign that something's going right. So we asked our residents what they value most about their housing after living there for a year. So I just added a few of those here that I'll cover. If not for C Street Cooperative, I would be living with strangers, renting a room. I have done this in the past and it is not sustainable. Because my housing costs are now stable and affordable, I no longer have to work 2 or 3 jobs to afford rent. Cooperative invested in a democratic operational structure, positions shareholders to govern talents, resources, and energies for common good outcomes. It also protects us from the widespread rent inflation we are seeing. And finally, I appreciate the new construction, financial relief, the light footprint, lifestyle adventure, getting to know and work with others on our board. Though challenging at time, it is a good stretch for us all. I believe we are all better for it. And so Dan introduced our latest project, which is an attempt to kind of bring this model to scale, 70 units on 3.5 acres, a large church property of a congregation of less than 30 members. So they reached out to us to as offering to sell us this land so that we could develop housing on it. It's a mix of studio, 1-bedroom and 2-bedroom units. And I think what's really interesting about this project, so our C Street was targeting the 60 to 80% demographic, which is the common demographic for home ownership programs. Whereas here we're able to offer carrying charges that are affordable to households at 30 to 50% AMI with a 60% AMI income limit. So that's a demographic that's commonly served by rental housing. So trying to demonstrate a project that is at a similar scale at 70 units and a similar target population to low-income rental housing that requires similar smaller amounts of subsidy, but is offering a pathway to ownership to the residents rather than simply a rental. The church, we bought the property from the church for $600,000, so that was it was a significantly under market rate price. But so it was kind of a win-win for the church because that money allowed them to continue to sustain their congregation because it's such a small congregation, and they also offered it to us at a reduced cost. I'd say it'd be closer to probably like $1 million, I guess. But yeah, total cost is at $160,000 per unit, and most of the subsidy for this project is coming through one-time subsidies awarded through the legislature rather than traditional OHCS programs. which kind of leads into what I found the major barrier to be in pursuing this model is the lack of public funding and incentives for shared equity homeownership, particularly cooperative housing, mainly because cooperatives sort of fall in this gray area somewhere between rental and homeownership. OHCS is divided into two divisions, the rental division and the homeownership division. So it took quite a bit of conversation to figure out which one we fell into, but ultimately it's considered home ownership since the residents own the homes. But the problem there is that in terms of new construction, there's just not much resources for building new construction projects, particularly large-scale homeownership projects and not, single-family houses. Lift home ownership is kind of the main subsidy program you can use to do this type of model. There's not currently a property tax exemption for the buildings, even though it's serving a similar target population as rental housing, which does receive that property tax exemption. I added a couple updates here because I think there has been some progress made on this in the legislature in that 40 million was approved in general funds towards new homeownership development, particularly looking to do more innovative models such as shared equity home ownership. And SquareOne actually received a $2 million direct allocation to do a shared equity home ownership pilot project, which we're using towards our Peace Village project. So I think there is progress being made in this direction, but in terms of really scaling this model, it's unfortunate that you're limited to such few resources. One way we're trying to overcome this barrier is forming the Oregon Cooperative Housing Network, which Mary has participated on. She was mentioning that. And so the purpose of this effort is just to create a statewide advocacy effort for cooperative housing, to promote the concept of cooperative housing as a desirable and beneficial form of home ownership, and to protect the common interests of housing co-ops in Oregon through education, research, lobbying, and the exchange of information. And so you'll see in like DC or New York, they have entities like this, and we're trying to create this to kind of make housing co-ops a little bit more of a familiar concept in Oregon, because we think they have an important role to play in addressing the housing problem. Our current legislative agenda, we're working on a property tax exemption. We're working with Representative Nancy Nathanson on that, so that bill will be introduced in this session. Amending an existing property tax exemption for rental housing to also include limited equity co-ops. I think Oregon Affordable Housing Tax Credits is another great opportunity where you are able, in rental housing projects, you're able to reduce the interest rate of your permanent loan by 4%. It's not extended to homeownership projects currently because it's assumed that each household has to take out its own loan, but by my understanding of the statutes, a limited equity co-op would actually qualify because there's a single loan, and that reduction in the interest rate can be directly shown in a reduction in the monthly housing costs of the residents, which is one of the requirements of the program. So we're trying to sort out whether we can already do that through OHCS or whether that will require some sort of technical fix in the statutes through the legislature. And then the final one I have on there is just first right of refusal to tenants to purchase their multifamily buildings. So something similar to this was done with manufactured dwelling park co-ops. That is what allows them to be purchased from landlords and co-owned by the residents. And Representative Campos actually had a bill to do this in the 21 session, and we're working with her to reintroduce that in this session because we think that will be an important thing to do. A few lessons learned, just scale. I think we learned that co-ops can work at both a small scale and a large scale, and there's pros and cons of each. Our C Street co-op serves an example as a small scale co-op as neighborhood infill. The co-op governance is simpler and more direct, where each member also serves on the co-op's board. It's possible to accommodate resident sweat equity during construction. And while each project may be small, we think this model has a lot of scalability potential because of kind of what I was talking about with C Street, where you can do this on typical residential lots. So there's numerous sites throughout cities in Oregon to replicate this model, and under HB 2001, that kind of provides a pathway for doing that, kind of expanding our existing stock of single-family housing to include denser affordable housing projects. So we call those middle housing co-ops, and then our larger co-ops we call village co-ops, which are new multifamily developments, which we're trying to position as a viable alternative to low-income rental housing. The co-op governance becomes representative, where a few members are elected to serve on the board and a committee structure may be necessary. But the larger scale of the co-op allows for economies of scale that allow for contracting out certain property management functions. Another key lesson is that education and training is very important, especially up front in the process, in terms of making sure people understand the differences in terms of the benefits and the responsibilities of cooperative housing compared to rental housing. In our first Emerald Village co-op that we did, we felt we ended up getting a lot of folks that were just applying because it was a cheap place to live, and there ended up being a lot of turnover in the very beginning. Since then, we've required, as part of the application process, residents have to come to an information session in order to even receive an application, in which, you know, we present, I put a chart up there that kind of, I won't go into it, but it kind of breaks down the various rights and responsibilities of living in a co-op so that people really understand what they're getting into, and that really kind of whittles down the applicants into folks that are more serious about wanting to live in this type of home ownership opportunity. Things that we provide in terms of education and training is hands-on practice and running meetings, developing and adopting proposals, marketing and new membership selection, mediation skills, and administrative infrastructure. And topics covered in depth include the co-op legal documents, the decision-making process, fair housing, and financial planning and budgeting, because ultimately the members of the co-op are setting their own annual budget each year and deciding how much it costs to live there. The target demographic, households must be living independently and willing to work cooperatively with neighbors. So the CLT provides education to the household pre-move-in and support to the co-op post-move-in, but it does not provide ongoing and intensive social services. So this is not intended to be an alternative to permanent supportive housing, where for residents that may be better suited for that type of housing. We do have a number of co-op members that do have an independent case manager, so there are folks that can work well within this system. It really just comes down to each individual. We think it can be a good model for anyone between 30 to 120% AMI, as demonstrated by the Lopez Community Land Trust. I think what's really interesting is that 30 to 60% demographic, and showing, you know, this is basically the only pathway to home ownership that I know of for that demographic. So I think that's really the unique aspect of this model. But also with the 60 to 80% with current market trends we're seeing, I think existing home ownership programs are finding it challenging to move that demographic into single family home ownership. So I think it's also important for that demographic. Yeah.
You have to repeat the question.
Hi. Well,
Yeah.
thank you for giving me the floor. So yeah, based off this slide right here, I'm curious about folks who've been incarcerated, and some of us know, or all of us know,
Yeah.
that it's really challenging for folks to rent and whatnot. So I just want to know, like, how does this process work for them and whatnot, like the intake process, and if they've been in like
Yeah.
solitary confinement, like that they don't want to be just in a room, like how is the selection of the home incorporated in that too, if they're willing to abide by all the guidelines?
Yeah, that's a great question. And each co-op is kind of going to have its own application and intake process, but I can kind of speak from our experience. So we select the initial group of residents, and then once the co-op is formed, a membership committee is formed, and the residents are ultimately responsible for carrying out that process. I would say in the example you gave, I don't think that wouldn't preclude them from living there. I think the point I mentioned on the first point was just in terms of working cooperatively with neighbors. You know, that's not for everybody, and I I think that wouldn't preclude them from getting in, but some people might have challenging working with their neighbors and handling conflict and that, and we've seen that. So it's certainly not a housing option for everybody, but I think it's a kind of a case by case example. Do you have anything to add to that, Dan?
Yeah, particularly when we were doing Opportunity Village and would come across quite a few people who had been incarcerated. The key issue is, what have you learned, and what have you changed? And as long as they can demonstrate, hey, I'm not a threat to anyone, and I've learned from this experience and so forth, then I think they can be a great candidate and bring that experience to the project. So yeah.
I'd also add, like, the application is a little different than rental application in that there's some open-ended questions where people speak to having worked in a group or providing examples of doing a community project or things like that. So that's another component that is kind of evaluated in the application process.
Hold on.
Sorry.
I'm just,
Yeah.
okay, yeah, all right, fine. I'm just thinking about fair housing and the rent and the application itself. I mean, I have a lot of things I'm thinking about. I'll spare you. I'm not going to go through all of them. But the one that pertaining to this is, how do you manage the application process and who makes the decisions about who comes in and who doesn't? And have you had to deal with fair housing issues in that regard?
So our program director, Jeff, could really speak better to that. I work more on the development end, and then my counterpart is Jeff, who kind of takes over after construction is complete and operations. But it is a balancing act in terms of following fair housing law and also running a cooperative. And that's actually, I think, one of the things I get at here on the final slides. In terms of diversity, equity, inclusion, one of the roles the CLT can play, and it's not going to be the first point, but I'll get to it, is providing robust outreach and partnerships pre-move-in. So reaching out to culturally specific organizations to be involved in the planning of the co-op and also ahead of the application process in order to reach diverse applicants. But then post-move-in, one of the roles the CLT plays, and this is an example of arranging DEI trainings for co-op memberships, but we also provide fair housing education to the co-op and teaching people how to balance that. And that's certainly an important piece that I think the CLT, somebody asked what's the point of the CLT. I think that's an important piece that residents of a co-op without any support or guidance might get themselves into trouble of not filing fair housing. So yeah, it's a balancing act. And does that answer your question?
Okay, I
I
have a
think that's
question.
that's the slide. Do you want to take questions, or do you want to let Dave speak first? You want to do questions? Yeah, okay, questions. Sorry.
Okay, I just want to say, one, that it's commendable what you've done. It's really, remarkable. Thank you so much. The other thing is, how much hands-on in terms of the residents, in terms of making the rules of the co-op? And then how do you unwind the thing when it doesn't work out? What's that process?
Yeah, so we basically set the co-op up with a framework in that we develop the initial legal documents. So there's a ground lease between the land trust and the co-op, and then the co-op has its own proprietary lease, which gives residents access to their units. There's the bylaws, and then there's the policies and procedures. So we set them up with an initial framework. We found that just starting from scratch and not having any of that stuff figured out up front is pretty messy. And so we basically developed template documents that we provide to each co-op at the start, and then they have the rights through their co-op process. They have a board of directors, and they have board meetings, and they have a decision-making process. They can amend and change their policies and procedures to meet their needs. Does that answer? What was there another piece to that question? When it doesn't work, I mean, sure. I'll be honest. Like, cooperative housing is definitely messier than rental housing, in that there's like a one-on. In rental housing, everybody's working together, and there's obviously social conflict and mediation that comes up with that. I think like one of our residents was getting at that, and that is challenging at times, but that she feels ultimately we're all better for it. I think it's a little bit more work, but I think the relationships you build and the skills and lessons that you learn are an important part of it. It's also a component that, you know, as the CLT, we have a co-op coordinator in each co-op, so they help with mediation and things like that, and helping residents work through differences when that type of thing comes up. Can you give me a specific what? Like, huh?
You know, it just blows up, it doesn't work for whatever reason, okay, and the person wants out. How do you
Are you talking about an
unwind it?
individual?
An individual,
Oh,
yes.
sure. Okay. So, I mean, the proprietary lease has grounds for default, and you know, if you default on your lease, you can be rather than being evicted from your housing unit, you can be removed from the co-op for not following the policies and procedures. You do have security of tenure. You can continue to live in that co-op unit for the rest of your life, and you can also pass the equity down to future generations within your family, but you have to abide by the policies and the procedures of the co-op, and if you don't, you can be removed.
So legally, where does the money go to unwind the money that they've invested in there?
Yeah, it's a good question. Again, I wish we had Jeff here because he really deals with those more technical. In terms of the share purchase, and that I'll just say, so I mean, we have operated 2 leasehold co-ops where that's not a component. There's not a share component. That's why I don't have a direct example of that. And with our limited equity co-op, C Street, we haven't had any turnover yet. But that's a good question that Jeff would probably be able to answer.
I mean, ultimately, they would have to sell their membership to
Yeah.
the next person
Yeah.
coming in, right? And so that's how they're going to get their money back.
Yeah, it's up to each individual to sell their, and so in a more typical situation, somebody decides to move, they list their unit for sale. Your question threw me for a loop a little bit because it's like, what happens if they get kicked out? I believe they would still be responsible for selling their share. They just wouldn't be a member of the co-op. Yeah.
In a worst case scenario, I think the co-op would always buy them out too and then resell it.
And when people die,
Yeah, it is inheritable.
And a nice thing about the co-op model is that there's no one answer to that. This all gets sorted out in the bylaws. So like in our bylaws, yeah, it can be handed down to the next person, to a family member, and then the family member can sell the share if they don't want the housing.
One of our C Street members has already put it in his will that his share will be inherited by his son. Yeah.
I'll go next. Many non-English speakers are left out of this opportunity. You mentioned that you outreach to diverse community. When you say you outreach to them, you rely on them giving the information in other languages, or do you have some type of outreach that is in other languages, and also within the units themselves, is there language access?
Yeah, we're currently working on that with our Peace Village project in terms of the application and outreach materials. I think one thing we're struggling with, I think we figured out how to do that on the front end, but one thing we're trying to figure out is how do you do that on an ongoing basis within the co-op, where the co-op might not, ideally there's somebody within the co-op, if it's big enough, that can provide translation services, but that's kind of a barrier that we haven't really figured out in terms of if there's meetings of the co-op after it's in operation, how do you deal with language barriers there? I think that's a challenge of this model. I mean, one idea we've come up with in terms of the co-op coordinator that we would hire would be bilingual so that they could provide that service. Do you have anything else to add, Dan?
Yeah. Well, again, the co-ops are autonomous, and so working with the co-ops to do problem solving and trying to figure out, okay, co-op, how can we help you, figure this out for your member who's not an English speaker, and then trusting that creative process might come up with its own solutions. As you said, one easy solution will be for us just to hire someone bilingual. Well, that will help if it's Spanish, but what if we get some other language? And it maybe it would be have to something that we build into the cost structure in some way. I don't have a good answer for it, except in a 70-member co-op, I would hopeful that the creative process of that co-op itself would help us figure it out. And sure. And that's why he's talking about the upfront. In fact, we've got a capacity grant that's pending right now just for that purpose, to make sure that we have all the documents translated and all the upfront stuff, so that at least when someone's coming in, they have full understanding of what it is. I think we want to hear from Dave to give us another concrete example before we get too many more questions.
First of all, I'm not sure if they're going to be concrete examples, but and I have two apologies up front. One is I'm generally a low-tech person, so I did a handout. The second apology, I didn't make enough copies. So if those could get passed around.
The reason I have been asking people to stand up, and I almost did it when, you know, Andy was speaking, I didn't realize, because I didn't hear his answer to my question, and I'm still going to ask it later if I get the chance, but I wanted to hear you. Because, you know, people project better when they stand up. Really. Yeah. Believe me, they do. So if you can do that, I would. Well,
let's try it sitting down, because I'm not sure how well I'll do standing up. But anyway, so just to give you a little background, again, my name's Dave Carbonneau. I've been in affordable housing development for the last 15, 20 years. I retired about 3 years ago, and it took me about 3 years to realize that I missed it, and I had an opportunity to work with a number of veterans in our community who are dealing with the permanent supportive housing. And so I set out to try to understand whether there's a better development model that could actually address the needs, the veterans' needs for permanent supportive housing. Just a little background, approximately 17% of the 300,000 veterans in Oregon are living in substandard or transitional housing. And these veterans, for the most part, are earning too much money to qualify for subsidized housing, but not enough money to be able to access decent market rate housing. As I talked to the veterans organization, they refer to these individuals as tweeners, people that are kind of stuck in the middle, making too much, but not enough. And I am a veteran, first of all, so I have a fundamental belief that all veterans should have access to decent housing. And I approached this initiative, and I've been following Andrew's work over the years, but I approached this initiative by re-examining the basic elements of development, starting with what and where we build, who owns it, and how is it financed, and then finally, how is it operated. This particular model that I've been working on, and this pilot that I've been working on, is urban infill pilot, which I think is interesting, at least to me, because in Portland in particular, there are so many opportunities to use a small lot to build smaller projects. This particular lot that I acquired and am working on is 7,700 square feet. And with the current zoning, an RM2 zoning, I was able to site 29 375 square feet, one-bedroom units on the property. But what I found to be the centerpiece of the model is the power of a cooperative ownership that provides the stability that all veterans are seeking. For purposes of thinking about a pro forma, and I've run numbers, and I assumed a down payment of $40,000 per resident. the cumulative member contribution is adequate to support the debt service and lease costs associated with this particular project. And the fact that I think the other asset or the other advantage of this is the ability to accumulate some wealth. So what I feel is perhaps the most critical element of this model, at least for veterans, is that it does give you an opportunity in an ownership situation where you can actually take the opportunity to tap into the camaraderie, and obviously when coupled with ownership opportunities and a supportive environment, individual in the veteran community can actually live in a supportive project. The pride of ownership is a huge element, creates a unique opportunity to support the for a support network and a permanent and stable living environment. As where I am right now is, again, if I had enough handouts, I would have been able to give everyone kind of a sight of what we're looking at in this situation. Given the fact that property is at a premium in Portland, I decided to go vertical, and working with a modular contractor down in Amsville. He's designed units that are stackable, and that's the only way we can get to the density that makes these projects pencil. I think that's basically it. I think what is intriguing to me and the work that Andrew's doing with the state is really trying to understand this whole question of what door do you go through, either through the rental door or through the home ownership door. I think, to me, what is interesting about this is that in the rental world, this is exactly the same process, the same development, the same reserves are required that you have in a rental situation, but with different owners. I mean, that's fundamentally the difference. I mean, and to me, I'd love to see the opportunity for the individuals who live in a unit take some of the ownership opportunity as opposed to investors.
And it really does come down to that. As soon as you give residents ownership, you're precluded from the majority of funding and incentives, and it's just very confusing as to why that is.
That kind of summarizes my comments. And
I was wondering if you could give just a little bit more on how you set that initial purchase price, like what goes into that calculation and how does that change over time? So if I buy for 10,000, do I sell for 10,000 or can I sell for 15 or 20? And what are you covering with that initial purchase? What's the math that gets you to 10,000?
Yeah, 10,000 is just what we found through doing outreach efforts to people in the income population that we were serving of, is this something that you can afford? We've also started a revolving loan fund so that everybody doesn't have to have that cost up front. But the purpose of it is that it provides a source of equity into the project. So, I mean, like I said, the higher it is, the less debt financing you have to do against the project, for example. And in terms of, you were asking about maximum resale value. So when somebody decides to move out, it's not guaranteed that they'll get that value of that equation I have on the screen there, but that's the maximum amount you can sell it for. Does that make sense? 3% simple interest plus improvements.
The important thing to get, and this took me a while to get it too, is you can't sell it on the open market, because the moment you do, it goes to the highest bidder and it's no longer affordable. So that one person lucks out because they cash in big time if they can triple, but the next person, so your affordability goes away. So that's why we set it at that max. And actually the 10,000 is somewhat arbitrary. You can set it at any level that makes sense, but multiply that by the number of units. It just gives you a little bit more to work with and lowers the amount of the mortgage that you then have to carry on the project. subsidy. Yeah, yeah.
In my pro formas up to this point, I've been using 40,000, but I've been working the numbers, basically working them backwards. How do I get to a $600 rent? And so that's basically the other side of the equation that you have to balance this against.
And another thing worth noting, you know, what I show on this slide in that gray box on the far right is that, you know, if your share price was $40,000, which is a lot for a low-income person to afford, there are a lot of homeownership down payment assistance that will cover up to 50% of that project. So that is one way to get subsidies into that project. But with, for example, our Peace Village project, that's serving a very low income demographic, which we didn't feel $10,000 would be affordable for their share purchase in that project is $5,000. And we're also creating a revolving loan so that everybody has to put in at least $1,000 up front, but then you can loan up to $4,000 from SquareOne's revolving loan fund and pay that back over time to not make that an upfront barrier. We do think it's important for people to have some skin in the game in terms of investing in ownership in the co-op, in terms of interests in participating and ensuring the success of the co-op. So it's really just a balancing act of accessibility, but also wanting that investment from the resident, but also it's part of the equation in the pro forma.
Sorry. So I'm wondering how your organization is able to sustain itself. Are you taking a financial like developer fee from these projects, and that's going into funding your organization?
We haven't done a good job of that until recently, so we're starting to do that. Like as Dan said, we were a ragtag group of activists that started Opportunity Village with no housing development experience that we built as volunteers. Emerald Village, you know, I think I was half-time and you were quarter time, and we didn't take any developer fee out of that. And we've started to do a little bit better. We're taking a developer fee on the Peace Village project, and that's hopefully going to allow us to kind of sustain and grow our organization to do more of these.
Yeah, and then, you know, typical grants and fundraising. We just held a big fundraiser where we raised $150,000 just because people see the work that we're doing and they want to support it.
Yeah, I'd also say we received several grants from Meyer Memorial Trust, so this was the latest one, but there was a series of them that really kind of allowed us to kind of, in many ways, build our organization and explore these innovative ideas, and now we're kind of in the stage where we're trying to transition into a sustainable organization that's not dependent on those foundation grants every year.
First off, I just want to say this is amazing, grassroots, like experimental, and I guess back to the valuation questions. What have you experienced with like identifying lenders for those individual share holders that want to purchase? And do you match them up, or what have your challenges been with that?
So that's the biggest, that's a major barrier to this program. So like in a market rate co-op, for example, the share price would be a much bigger percentage of the overall project costs. But the reason you can't really, there's only one market rate co-op, Park Place here in Portland, and it's almost all, I think, older residents, and they all have to have, it's all because they need cash to be able to purchase that that share purchase up front, because banks don't make individual share purchase loans. They do in places like DC and New York. So that's just a reality of cooperative housing being more unfamiliar on the West Coast. So that's why we created kind of our own revolving loan fund to kind of serve as our own lender on these smaller loans. And that's why we've kept our share prices very low so that you don't have to rely on big loans there. And we try to have more of a larger single mortgage that the co-op holds that's paid through the carrying charge and doesn't require an individual to qualify for that loan. That's sort of the point.
Just one other comment on the source of funding and the banks that might be involved. There is a bank out of DC, National Cooperative Bank, that has expressed an interest in coming out here. Obviously, they want to see more volume than one or two projects, but I think I think as the concept grows, I think we'll see more banks getting into the game.
We also had some success in what we call social investors, people with, some money that we could offer a return. And we basically said, we won't match what you could get on the market, but we'll pay you 3, 4, or 5% on your money. And we got over a couple $100,000 that way, both for the construction financing of the C Street project. Was what, $450 that we raised that way from our social investors, and then a portion of that is a long-term, a 10-year investment that we're paying back those social investors on the small portion of that we couldn't underwrite from the bank. And so there is a secondary loan that's just to private individuals.
I think Dave's point to the National Cooperative Bank is a good long-term strategy to work towards, and that's part of our interest in forming a statewide advocacy program to kind of show more of a collective interest in cooperative housing. I think, but in terms of our experience in talking about and doing this work, we found that there's a lot of other developers out there interested in this model, but in terms of the folks that are actually pursuing it, it tends to be more of a passion project. I take that's what that is for you. And I think really to get more developers to follow this model, we need to realign our public funding and incentive programs to allow for this to happen, because you're really disincentivized for choosing this route in many ways. So, but it seems like that the fixes to changing that aren't that complicated. It's just a matter of the time that it takes to do it.
I have a couple questions. One is, what is the long-term maintenance plan on these? The first 10 years, low maintenance, low cost, but as these properties age, what's your long-term plan? And then also, what are the terms on the debt that you're on the long-term debt? What's your amortization? What's your length of the debt? And then also, what happens with that debt equity that they're as they pay that debt down?
Right, sure. I guess I would say in terms of the long-term maintenance plan, part of the carrying charge that residents pay each month goes towards a replacement reserve. So they pay both a maintenance fee to cover general maintenance, and then a portion of that goes towards a replacement reserve. We're doing a replacement reserve study for our Peace Village project, since it's a much larger project, and just figuring out what those costs are over the years and calculating that into the monthly price that folks are paying to the co-op each month. In terms of the mortgage, it varies. We've worked largely with Summit Bank. You're looking for like an interest rate?
More term and amortization. How long is the debt going to be on the property?
Yeah, we have I think on our C Street project, we have a 30-year loan at 5.5%, and SquareOne and the C Street co-op are co-borrowers because it's secured against the land and the buildings. And then as that gets paid off, I mean, I think that's why I think it's not just a permanently affordable housing model. It's actually going to become progressively more affordable in that after that loan's paid off, the co-op has the option of reducing its monthly carrying charge if that debt payment goes away. It's also possible that unforeseen maintenance issues could come up that they don't plan for in the long-term reserve, so they may have to take out another loan. But it's ultimately up to the co-op in terms of how they manage their resources and set their rent. The co-op has a finance committee that basically sets an annual budget, so they're looking at what they spent last year and projecting what they're going to spend next year. But it's ultimately their decision, and we provide them technical assistance on how to do that.
Your last question about when the mortgage is paid off, where does that equity go? So in essence, the difference between the shares, what the members own, and then the accumulated equity of the project is what the co-op owns. So they do, yeah. Yeah, no, they can't resell the individual ones, but there's a value difference between the membership share and what the value of the property of the improvements is, and that's equity that the co-op itself has. And then they could choose at some point to cash in that equity if they want to build a swimming pool and then pass on the charge. That would be their choice.
I think the East Blair Housing Co-op in Eugene, which is kind of a inspiration for us, they formed back in 1982, so they've been around. They just celebrated their 40-year anniversary. So I think they provide some interesting examples of this, to where, like, for example, once they paid off their loan, they expanded and bought more neighboring properties next door, and are kind of growing their co-op. And so there's a number of possibilities, but it's ultimately up to the co-op.
A lot of the examples that you showed were 1-bedroom or studio units. Do you see this model working for multi-bedroom, like 2 to 5?
I think that's a great question, and something I've thought a lot about. We kind of got started with the tiny house model, and so we've naturally kind of stayed more towards the smaller household sizes. I don't have a definitive answer to that, but I do my personal feelings is that the cooperative model is better for smaller households, and once you get into larger families, I think that more of the CLT model might be better. But there are examples of cooperatives that serve larger families too. It's just kind of our niche has been so far serving smaller households.
My question was actually going to get a little bit about who is lending on the acquisition itself, and so it sounds like so far your partner has been Summit Bank. So I think you answered that, and I'm actually with Casa of Oregon. So I'm curious, not at all competitively, but curious, trying to figure out what different market options or market segments are we serving, right? And what are the trade-offs? So I am curious to hear more about what successes you're finding. And to me, I think perhaps the most obvious one is access, is what is the buy-in? And that's a big difference. The buy-in, if you use this CLT, what did you call it? Limited LEC, limited equity co-op.
It's a mouthful, yeah.
Yeah. I haven't seen the LEC acronym before.
Community Land Trust Limited Equity Cooperative Hybrid.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, yeah, well, yeah, my department is the Manufactured Housing Cooperative Development Center, so but yeah, trying to hammer out what the trade-offs between the residents owning their own home and just simply having a cooperative plus resident homeowner model versus this CLT plus LEC plus resident model. I would love to hear your thoughts on what the trade-offs are. And I had a follow-up there. Which is converting existing stock. And it sounds like if you have any ideas about that rather than new construction, sounds like you made a nod to that with your advocacy push for rights of first refusal for multifamily, which I'm all in for. And I think if anybody is advocacy minded in here, would be huge. But yeah, existing stock and the trade-offs between those two models as my inquiries.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. I think the model we're describing might work better for new construction. Like, I think your model makes a lot of sense for manufactured dwellings because it makes sense for the resident to own those, and it's easy for the residents to own those. Whereas if we were to allow residents to own their individual house, that's effectively a condo. Right, and so a condo in a cooperative, well, yeah. Well, you can't. One of the distinguishing features of a cooperative is that you don't own your own house. You own a share in the cooperative, which owns all the houses. In a housing cooperative. And that's not it's not technically a housing co-op, I don't think. I'm just saying, like,
work it out later.
Yeah, they cooperatively own the park, right? They don't cooperatively own their housing, so it's I'm not to say one's better than the other, because honestly, this is something I've thought about and I don't have a definitive answer for you. I think they're two good models, and I don't know.
Actually, I'd like to follow up a tiny bit. The question, one of the things we've been looking at also is this the idea of a limited equity co-op around multifamily, existing multifamily unit buildings that are maybe unregulated affordable housing. But one of the barriers to that, of course, is there's a lot of needs in those. The reason they're unregulated and still affordable is because they're not great housing. So thinking about what models you maybe have seen where folks have done that, and that does tie together some of the issues around preservation that we've talked about as an industry. And then again, I saw that nod to that in your advocacy slide. So I'm just curious if you have any
In
thoughts
terms of
or
like
ideas.
conversion of multifamily, existing
Yeah, I mean,
multifamily.
we are looking at that. We just see there's a huge, I mean, $100,000 a unit is amazing, and that's great, but that is not what you're going to get if you need to rehab an existing building. And so I'm just curious about what models maybe you've seen there and ideas you might have.
I think it's something I'd like to get into that I don't have a lot of experience with in terms of conversion of existing buildings to a cooperative. There is an example, one other organization that's also doing this CLT-LEC thing is in the Bay Area. I think it's called the Bay Area CLT maybe. And they're doing exactly what you're saying in terms of they're not doing new construction, they're acquiring existing buildings in the Bay Area and having them be cooperatively owned. I believe it's Bay Area CLT, but I don't have any direct experience in it, so I can't really speak directly to it. But it does seem like a good idea just in terms of that develop new housing. But I'm sure it has its own challenges. Really what you're doing though with manufactured dwelling parks, right? It's just a different physical structure, so.
Okay. Okay. My name is Mary Vogel, and I live downtown in downtown Portland in a HUD subsidized building that is owned by Schnitzer Properties. There are about 100 units in it, and I can't imagine any of them wanting to take over the building, you know, and turn it into cooperative housing. That's the problem that I have with, and you know, the way, and let me back up and say.
Well, maybe you could speak to that though, because I imagine people probably feel that way with manufactured dwelling
I have
parks.
no idea what you're saying.
Oh, I'm
but
sorry.
In any case, I just wanted to back up and say that I knew Bob Swan, who brought the community land trust model to North America, and I knew Chuck Mathai and Wally and Juanita when they were in Greenfield, Massachusetts. So, you know, I am entirely familiar with the community land trust model, believe me. And I've also been following Home Forward and what they're doing. And they're only focused on home ownership. But in any case, so I just wanted to say that I think, you know, back to my original question about having a mix of
Yeah.
both market rate and, can you stand up when you answer me? You
Oh.
really do project better.
Do I?
But in any case, yes, so, all right, so, okay.
I guess I would just about your point about the people in your building, you can't imagine them starting a co-op. And I imagine that's probably the case with some of the manufactured dwelling parks where it's neighbors that have never talked to each other. But I guess I would imagine that in a conversion, it's not as if 100% of your neighbors are going to continue to live there and form the co-op, but it typically takes a core group that might come together with a set of ideas and interests and initiative. And folks that get on board, and other people move. Is that more or less your experience? Yeah. That's just my guess. Yeah. She said there's a lot of education.
I'm going to ask, actually, this is a question For Andrew, on the membership of a co-op, is it just limited to residents, or can outside individuals who are interested in an investment? Or do you start running into some finance regulations that make that a little stickier?
Yeah, again, that would be a better question for Jeff. I'm not kind of the legal document guy, but I mean, essentially you can write anything into bylaws if you have an attorney that is creative enough. But I mean, in our co-ops, and I think part of the point of the co-op is that one member, one vote, and that you have to live in the co-op if it's a housing co-op. That's the way we've done it. I don't know if there's another way to do it.
So I think we're at our time, and we would welcome any further conversation. You can, reach us at our, thank you, our website, squareonevillages.org. Andy's email is andrew@squareonevillages. Mine is dan@squareonevillages. But we appreciate this time and glad to answer any other questions afterwards. Thank you.